Frank, welcome. I know you're in beautiful California. Here we are in La Paz, Bolivia, at high altitude, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to share this Facebook Live session. A lot of your admirers, fans, and followers are going to be tuned in English, and then we'll do this session, as I was telling them, we'll put the subtitles so people can watch it later with subtitles in Spanish. But welcome, Frank, and it's a pleasure for you to spend this minutes here with us.
Tuto, thank you very much for inviting me on your show. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Frank. I'll start with the first point. I was reading the list of your books, by the way, and maybe you ought to check the algorithm. While we were looking at them in Kindle, just a small aside, the two in political order are in English about $12. In Spanish, they're $6. I don't know how the algorithm works, but a good opportunity for the ones that want to read it in Spanish. Identity costs $1 more in Spanish than in English, but a little curious fact about the availability of your books in Amazon and Kindle. I wanted to start with you on how you see the magnitude of coronavirus, this crisis, and where would you place it in the history of events that have dramatically reshaped our world. If you take, I don't want to go back to the Roman Empire or the steam engine, but if we look at the last century and we pick some salient points, World War I, the Great Depression of 1929, World War II, the fall of the Berlin Wall, 9/11 in 2001, 2008 financial crisis, do you think by now coronavirus fits within that historical context because of this, the possibility that it has to create many changes coming up ahead?
I think that this crisis is at least of the magnitude of September 11th or of the financial crisis in 2008. I suspect when we're finally done with it, it's actually going to have a deeper effect, certainly than the 2008 crisis, because already I think it's pretty clear that the economic consequences are going to be deeper. There's going to be more unemployment, more businesses shutting. It's going to affect much larger parts of the world. And it could have very large political effects. I think for countries with weak public health systems and that are poor and don't have the resources to fight the epidemic, I think it has the potential of being extremely destabilizing. I also think that there could be some good things that come out of it, because oftentimes it requires an external shock to get countries to realize that they really need to reform. And that's really true in my country. I think that, you know, the United States has been really the only rich country that didn't have a universal healthcare system. Every other rich country, you know, in Europe, in Asia, Australia, New Zealand, all of these countries have had these systems in place for some time. And I think that the crisis is revealing the inequalities that exist in the American healthcare system. And that's something I think that is really a scandal. It really needs to be corrected. And so I can imagine a set of political events that, you know, would lead to actually some deep reform being enacted in the United States.
Interesting. So in a way, you're saying that inside the U.S., coronavirus may achieve what Bernie Sanders, through several years of campaigning, was not able to achieve, which is universal health care for the U.S. It'd be an interesting development to see that happens. Do you think the magnitude of this, you were saying that in terms of economic impact, will be greater than the 2008 financial crisis? Could this be a modern combination of, say, the Spanish flu of 1918 that killed millions of people, and the Great Depression of 1929 that created massive unemployment and economic crash, but in a world that is today globalized, and therefore putting this, a merger of these two events, Spanish flu and the Great Depression of 1929, on steroids on a globalized, interconnected, financially hyperlinked world? Could it have that type of effect?
I think it could. As far as I can see, the disease is not going to disappear within, you know, a month or two. Like the Spanish flu itself, there will probably be new waves where the disease will return. And that means that the economic impact is going to be much longer lasting. I personally think that Wall Street is crazy. I think that the stock market in the US is anticipating, what they call a V-shaped recovery, where after a month or so, production will come roaring back. And I just don't see that happening. And I think it's going to have big effects on the way a lot of people live. I think, we're so interconnected. We're so used to cheap travel to go all over the world. And I think in many ways that could simply come to an end. And if it does, there are a lot of sectors that will be deeply affected by it. There's also some interesting side effects. One of the things we had been concerned about in the United States was the growing power of these big internet platforms like Facebook and Google, Microsoft, Apple, because they have become virtual nation states unto themselves. They've got huge cash reserves and have dominated not just North America, but the entire world in many respects. And I think this crisis is actually going to make them stronger, because it's turning out that digital technology is really the backbone that makes, we couldn't be having this conversation if it weren't for Zoom and if it weren't for the internet. And I think that it's demonstrating that we can live in that, or some of us can live in that virtual world and actually, do well in it. And I think that's going to further entrench the power of these companies. And it's got, other, I think, strong implications for privacy, because with all the contact tracing that societies are going to do in the future, there's going to be a big incentive to be able to follow your citizens closely, wherever around the world they travel. So there'll be endless second and third order consequences coming out of this.
Interesting. Do you foresee a movement to like trust busting, to anti-monopoly on the big companies, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Google?
Well, there had been
break them up.
Yeah,
after this?
there had been a movement in that direction prior to the crisis. Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden and several of the Democratic candidates had argued that we should take antitrust, much more seriously than we have. And by the way, I agree with that. I think that the United States has allowed too much industrial concentration to occur over the past 20 years. But I think now with the crisis, it's going to be much harder to make that argument, partly because these companies are, the essential backbone of, of communications in a period where people can't meet physically. Plus, which I think that a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises are going to get wiped out as a result of a prolonged economic downturn. And these big companies have, so much cash on hand that they're going to be able to survive.
Interesting. Let me move on to a topic that perhaps this crisis will allow us to do comparisons that were not possible in the past. Before we had Mexico tequila crisis, or maybe we had a 2008 U.S. financial crisis hitting U.S. and Europe. But this coronavirus, since it's going worldwide, it is allowing us to test or to put to a test the competency, the efficiency of states everywhere, just about worldwide, in terms of health, capacity to enforce quarantines, agility to move, how to respond to economic emergencies, how to rebuild the economy. So in that sense, give us a quick rundown of how do you compare the way some states have dealt with this. First, the three big powers, then we'll move to democratic systems and federal system. But first, the three big powers, China, EU, and US. How do you evaluate their management of this crisis?
Well, I think there's a lot of variance within that group of countries. I think that it's not at all clear to me that democracies are doing worse than authoritarian governments. I mean, that's what some people have said because of China's success in controlling the virus. But if you look around the world, there's plenty of democracies that have done well. South Korea is an outstanding case. I mean, they're down to basically 0 new infections. And the reason that they were so effective was they had a permanent bureaucracy that had a lot of expertise in it. There's a woman that's the head of the Korean public health system. who has become the most trusted leader in that country. They had good state capacity that was able to ramp up testing very quickly, do a lot of contact tracing, and as a result, they've come through it, very well. And to top it all off, they had a national election a couple of weeks ago, and the ruling party was rewarded for having been so competent in dealing with this crisis. And I think other countries, Taiwan, Germany, and other countries in Northern Europe have similarly done well, whereas the United States and Britain have done poorly. I actually think that the real correlation is not between democracy and either good or bad performance, but I think that there's plenty of populist leaders that have done very poorly, and both the United States and to a lesser extent Britain, have that kind of leader. I think Bolsonaro in Brazil is another, great case of that, and that I think is a real danger, because populists are suspicious of elites. They claim that the people are being screwed by these elites that have been running their country for all these years. They don't want to listen to expert advice, and I think that's exactly the trap that Trump fell into. He put his own political interests ahead of the advice he was getting from, the public health community, and as a result, we have the largest number of deaths and infections of any country in the world.
Interesting. The correlation is more to do with populist versus institutional governments versus autocracies or democracies, and that kind of leads me to a question I wanted to ask you. I never thought I would see a club, very eclectic, of, shall we say, skeptics or slow movers or downright denialists in the Americas, in our part of the world now, that was going to be made up of Bolsonaro, Brazil, Trump in the US, Ortega in Nicaragua, and López Obrador in Mexico. If you try to find what's common about those four individuals, only this. I think very little would you find. How do you, I think that has to do with the fact that you mentioned them as populist or Ortega downright authoritarian. But what do you make of this, the composition of this very eclectic club of the Americas of, let's call them skeptics about coronavirus initially, for lack of a better term?
I think it makes my point about populists. I mean, the thing is, if you have a fully authoritarian system, you don't have to worry about the next election. Just like the Chinese Communist Party, they're not up for election in November, and so they can afford to take a longer term view of what they think is in the public interest. But populists have to remain popular, and a lot of them have cultivated a cult of personality around themselves. They want to see themselves as perpetually successful. They don't like hearing bad news, and so therefore they've got a instinct to try to suppress bad information. And so there's a real difficulty, I think, that they have in governing. That is to say, actually making the machinery of government run in the public interest, because ultimately they're more worried about their own political survival. And so that's why I think at a left-wing populist, AMLO, or maybe two of them with Ortega, and then you've got two right-wing populists, Bolsonaro and Trump, and they're all headed in that same direction.
Yeah, pretty much. Okay, if you could expand on, you wrote about institutions on the paper that you edited about the difference between Latin America and the US, I think it's in 2009, forms of government, parliamentarian, Westminster system, federal systems. And one thing that we found in at least Brazil, Mexico, and the United States is that you had presidents or executives that were slow off the mark, shall we say, and perhaps even in denial. And that allowed for two sets of actors to take over. One is governors, whose popularity skyrocketed, whether it's Doria in Sao Paulo, or Inslee in Washington, or Como in New York, or the same thing with the people in Nuevo León in Mexico. And the other thing, since the president did not take this head on, it allowed for the onset or the appearance of, shall we say, the South Korean case that you mentioned, the health superstars. Mandetta in Brazil was such a superstar, the health minister, that he got canned. Lopez-Gatell in Mexico has become the most trustworthy figure. He's the health minister, or the role that Dr. Fauci plays in the U.S. If you could perhaps comment something about the intersection of political systems and federal systems that allow strong regional governments to compensate for lack of action of an executive.
Well, I think that you said it. A federal system, it has advantages and disadvantages. If you have a competent executive, a president running the country, then sometimes federalism can be a big obstacle to doing the right thing because you get pockets of resistance, and that's really the story of the United States and the South with racial equality and so forth. But on the other hand, if you have a very weak or incompetent or poor leader at the national level, the federalism allows states to protect themselves because they don't have to listen to the directions that are coming from the central government. And I think we've seen both of those. I mean, so this is a larger discussion. I think it's really unfortunate that Latin America copied American presidentialism when the states of Latin America became independent in the 19th century, because I think that it's worked in the United States up until the last 20 years or so, only because there were more consensual mechanisms in Congress and between the two parties that allowed agreement in a situation with very dispersed powers. But I think it's dangerous to personalize power in a single individual, an elected president. If in a parliamentary system you have a leader, a prime minister who is crazy, doesn't take advice, tells people to do things like inject themselves with disinfectant, the party can just remove that person and put somebody better in. But in our hemisphere, pretty much we're stuck with these presidents who are there for fixed terms. The only way to get rid of them is like what they did to Dilma in Brazil, which is a very ugly process of impeachment. And it makes, I think, the system rigid, and it also leads to these situations of deadlock between the president and Congress very frequently, and that's something we've also seen in the United States. So I think that a parliamentary system of a European type with a permanent bureaucracy and a professionalized civil service is really actually a much better institutional form. I mean, I guess that's the other problem in Latin America, is that relatively few Latin American countries have really professionalized civil services. There's still too much politicization of the people that actually make the machinery of government operate. And as you say, when you get somebody very competent, like the Mexican health minister, people like that because, that's really modern government at work.
Interesting. And I would add here that presidential has absolute power for a fixed term, and the problem comes when you have the case of Nicaragua, Honduras, or Bolivia, where they modify the terms even though they're in the Constitution. And it'd be interesting. You should keep your eye out. Come May, the Inter-American Court of San Jose, we worked on this for a couple of years, will give us a verdict, because the trick that was used is to pretend that it was an inter-American human right to be able to run for office forever in Nicaragua and Honduras and Bolivia, and there will be a verdict on this. So hopefully at least that part will be somewhat constrained in that sense. If I could switch, Frank, to how do you think this coronavirus will affect what you describe wonderfully in your identity book, these identity, the sense of identity of females, of meaning something, and how it's led to the rise of anti-immigrant movements. Particularly, you describe in detail the ones in U.S. and Europe. I could see a scenario where Europe and the U.S. eventually get coronavirus under control, and then it explodes in Mexico and Latin America. It explodes in parts of North Africa, and then the migration, all the issues that you point out in your book, Identity, would have one more to add. You look different, you're trying to take my job away, you're trying to get welfare, and you're bringing the coronavirus back, which will be just a great scenario for the ones that want to build walls and separate. How do you see the coronavirus backlash feeding or strengthening the anti-immigrant sentiment, particularly in the US and Europe?
Well, I think that's what people are worried about. There was plenty of anti-immigrant sentiment, xenophobia, nationalism on the rise because of the rise of these populist politicians all over the world prior to the crisis. And obviously, when traveling across international borders is what spread the crisis, it reinforces that tendency. So I would worry about that a lot. It is also, though, creating some opposite kinds of incentives, because it's pretty clear that you also need a fair amount of international cooperation in order to, get to the roots of the crisis, in order to put in place protective measures and so forth. And so I think you're going to have a battle between these two forces, ones that seek to cut countries off from the outside world and others that seek greater cooperation. At the moment, I sort of think that the nationalistic forces are going to be stronger, but it's very hard to predict how this is going to evolve over the next few months and years.
Interesting. There was an old saying in the last 20th century that said economically, when the U.S. caught a flu, Latin America got pneumonia. Whenever there were difficulties in the U.S., that used to be true. 2008 proved that there was a dividing line. The U.S. got a severe flu in 2008, and Central America and the Caribbean got a big-time pneumonia. But South America kept growing because we figured out in 2008 that our South American economy, selling energy, selling minerals, selling food to China, the Panama Canal became a dividing line. We're Chinese, economically speaking, from the Panama Canal on south. In this coming U.S.-China rivalry, do you see this Panama Canal break in Latin America strengthening and making South America even more dependent, not just economically, but also in terms of health and masks and these things? And do you see that this area of influence of China being more linked to South America, U.S. still to Central American, Caribbean, can only be strengthened? And how do you see that playing out post-coronavirus?
Well, it's I think that one of the long-term effects of the crisis is going to be to accelerate the shift of the global economy, not just in the Western Hemisphere, but everywhere, towards Eurasia and towards East Asia in particular, because it's not just China, but Korea, Taiwan, Japan have all managed to control the epidemic, fairly well, and that means that they're going to recover economically faster than Europe or North America. And so I think there'll be a general continuing concentration of the world's economy on China. Now, this is complicated by all sorts of things. So, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative that China had launched in order to connect itself to the rest of the world is really going to slow down because of this, because a lot of poor countries are now demanding renegotiation of their loans to China. Many of them have gotten overextended. They borrowed too much money from China. And by the way, there's several of those countries in Latin America, beginning with Venezuela, but Ecuador and Argentina. I mean, there's quite a lot of Chinese money there. So it's a little bit complicated. I think that there will be this, slow gravitational pull towards China and the rest of East Asia, but there's also going to be a lot of politics intervening and a lot of resentment of Chinese incursions and unhappiness with Chinese behavior in these, debt situations.
If you could comment, Frank, briefly now on something that you've talked about, that coronavirus is giving warlike powers, like if you're in the middle of a conflagration or a war, to everybody, to all states. You're bypassing Congresses. And imagine if somebody said the government executive without legislative approval wants to confine people in their homes, you can only leave, like we are here, 1 day a week for 4 hours. And then later, depending on your license plate and depending on the last digit of your ID, you can go. And then even Salvador is doing this against the Congress, against courts. So it is comparing great power to executives as typical of a emergency, a war, or this coronavirus. The concern would be, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about how do you see that playing in terms of the Latin American and the developing world. Clearly, in the U.S. and Germany and Italy and France, those extra powers can be crawled back. China, Singapore probably did not need them, and they already had them. But let's say Eastern European countries, Viktor Orban in Hungary, or the countries that are getting it in Latin America, it can be very decaying for the political order, to use your book, to have an overwhelming executive with no checks and balances. How do you see that evolving, and can those emergency powers be crawled back? And is there not a perverse incentive, if you like, to grab onto power from the executive to make coronavirus last as long as possible? Because as long as it's there, you have amazing economic and confinement powers and emergency money, and you can give money here, right and left. You can buy without going out to bid directly for your cronies. I mean, it's a wonderful time if you want to be an authoritarian. So how do you crawl back those powers? And do you have a concern about the fact that in Eastern Europe or Latin America, it may tend to entrench authoritarian executives?
Well, I think you said it better than I could. I think that this crisis.
Oh, no.
It's been a great opportunity for authoritarians all over the world to grab special powers and then not to return them. I mean, in Eastern Europe, it's really Viktor Orban in Hungary that's been the pioneer in this regard. He was voted emergency powers by the parliament, and he can basically do anything he wants without any checks on his power. And the thing is, in Latin America, you didn't need a crisis like this for presidents to be claiming these powers. Like in Argentina, the president has been given, executive emergency power, and they're not in a crisis. Congress, the Argentine Congress, completely abdicated its responsibility over the budget and simply let the president make the budget every year. So this is nothing new to Latin America, and I think that it's going to be a big problem going forward. I think that what's the solution to this? Well, the solution lies in politics. It lies in the ability to organize, first of all, to get out information, through a free press about these power grabs. It requires mobilization of civil society, of ordinary people to oppose this kind of concentrated power. It requires political parties that can put aside all their squabbling and differences in order to, successfully contest elections. And ultimately, Latin America is a pretty democratic part of the world, and I think that ultimately you have to use democratic means in order to regain power.
Yeah, interesting.
And I would say one further thing. I think that there is an international dimension to this, because what the rest of the world thinks and the kind of influence that it exerts is also important. And obviously that's been very true in Latin America. I think that right now, for the past 3.5 years, essentially the United States has abdicated, its responsibility in that regard. And, there are many abuses that have occurred in many parts of the Western Hemisphere that, have been greeted by complete silence from Washington. So I think that it's also important for the U.S. and for Europe to return to a leadership role in trying to set international standards for how countries ought to be governed, both in terms of democracy and in terms of anti-corruption. Because in addition to all the other things you said, when governments are handing out money left and right, the opportunities for corruption are enormous. And that's something also that we really have to be very vigilant about.
Yeah. If you can ask you quickly, how do you see things for Latin America? This is went from Asia to Europe to the US, it's just coming to us. The wave is a bit later. We have some strengths. We have younger population. We're not as globalized in terms of interconnection. We shut down earlier in terms of confinements and closing down airports and borders. But no matter how you slice it, in Latin America, we have weaker health systems, a lot of informal sectors. people that you cannot reach with economic short-term alleviation because they live day to day and they are in the informal sector. And clearly the reconstruction is going to be large because tourism is going to crater, remittances are going to come down, the price of oil is coming down, foreign funding is flowing out. It is not going to be a pretty sight. And that's going to put overwhelming importance in the multilaterals. It seems like we're going back again to the time where the IMF, World Bank, and IDB, and I'd say the IMF is capitalized, but the World Bank and IDB are sorely lacking. And there could be a long queue in terms of countries coming to those multilaterals. So if you could comment a bit on how do you see the coronavirus that is getting later to Latin America with our characteristics, effects that you foresee for us, and then a bit on how do you see the role of the multilaterals in terms of the reconstruction?
Well, I hope that Latin America does not depend on the multilaterals too much. I think that they obviously can play a very important role in a financial crisis, keeping banks liquid and, preventing bank failures from cascading out of control. But ultimately, I think that, what would be very good to happen is if the crisis actually underlined the weakness of the governance systems of many Latin American countries and then began to create a consensus in terms of fixing them. I think that one of the big problems in that region is this weak governance, is the fact that you don't have basic state capacity to provide social services, on a universal basis. And that's something that really needed to be fixed before the crisis. And I think the crisis will underline just how dangerous it is to leave those problems unfixed. The inequality problem, being able to have social protections in place, not just for formal sector workers, but, to be able to get as many people out of the informal sector under a kind of uniform set of labor standards. So, I think that's the task, and that's fundamentally an internal political issue, whether there are leaders that are willing to take up the cause of those sorts of reforms.
Two last questions, Frank, more on the personal side. I think a little known factoid is that in your famous End of History and Last Man, you mentioned Donald Trump as somebody who wanted to get recognition on the business side, and you mentioned him in passing in the End of History of Last Man. Did you ever think that, I got how many years later is it? Almost 25, 27 years later, he would become president? And I see some of the things Larry Diamond wrote a piece about the dangers of Trump getting reelected in 2020. What do you think the chances are of somebody taking the title of your famous book and writing something along the lines of Trump, the man that last ended the historical domination of the U.S., particularly with the rise of China and what you're seeing? But tell us a little bit about how do you see the fact that you mentioned somebody passing and now he is a deep subject of a study of the political phenomenon that you keep looking at?
Well, the reason I mentioned him in that book back in the early 1990s was that I was trying to argue that in a democratic system linked to a capitalist economy, you always have to worry about really ambitious individuals who could be a Julius Caesar that would threaten, the republic. And at that time, it seemed like Donald Trump would be happy just being a real estate developer and becoming very rich, and that was insulating the United States from, this danger of a strongman. But then it turned out that just being a developer, actually, he wasn't a very successful developer. He went bankrupt twice. Then he became a reality show star, and he kept wanting more and more recognition, and so that's what brought him into politics. So ultimately, that safeguard didn't work, and I think it shows in a certain sense what the problem of the end of history is. I mean, it was a very misunderstood term, but the basic idea is if you settle the basic social inequalities through a system that provides a lot of peace and prosperity for its citizens, as is the case in many rich countries around the world, there's still room for those. There's still going to be those individuals that have greater than normal ambitions. And that has always been a destabilizing force in politics. And I think what we've seen is, that story, unfortunately, playing out. Now, fortunately, on the other hand, we have a good set of checks and balances in the United States. We have an institutional system that's designed to prevent too much power from accumulating in the hands of one individual like that. And so up to this point, I think, the threat has been relatively well contained. But it's something that we, perpetually have to worry about.
Thank you, Frank. My last one is just kind of an anecdotal question. I remember in 2009, 2010, some of those years, one of those Washington events, you had just compiled the book on explaining the gap between Latin America and the U.S., the Peace on Institutions. Could you have ever fathomed back then that years later, South America or Latin America would have the Catholic Pope with Peronista inclinations, and that he would have picked as his papal name Francis?
No, I must say that was not something that I envisioned, but the whole region has been very surprising over the years. I had been quite hopeful, back in the 2000s, that you had a center-left and a center-right government in Mexico and Brazil, the two biggest countries, and they seem to be moving towards a more European-style politics. And now those two countries one has a left-wing populist and the other has a right-wing populist. And so, in many ways we've gone backwards. But, just to end on a more optimistic note, it is impressive the way, your country, Peru, Colombia, even Argentina under the new president Fernandez have actually done pretty well in, imposing a quarantine and enforcing it and getting a fairly high level of compliance. And so
Yep.
I think the world still can surprise us politically.
Yep, you're correct. I think Google does these maps of how the quarantines are working, and it publishes the reduction of transit in public and parks, shopping centers, and what have you. My country's got like 92, 88. We have very sky high reduction. So we, despite what we like to think of ourselves as indisciplined, what have you, we are being very disciplined on the quarantine. Of course, the challenge is then to test massively and then respond with the sanitary systems. But again, we have plenty of challenges ahead. Thank you very much, Frank, for sharing these minutes of your very busy time with us in this Facebook Live. You have, like I said, lots of admirers. Your books are on Kindle, so if you see the Spanish, which again, a couple of them are half price in Spanish compared to English and Amazon Kindle, if you see their sales spike a little bit in Bolivia, we're a small country. Well, I hope it happens because you were kind and generous enough to share your time with us. But thank you very much. And any parting or last words that you want for our people that have been following this session?
Well, I'd say you're going through a really difficult, political transition right now. So I hope that Bolivia sticks to its democratic principles in the end. And I wish you the best of luck, in both you, Tuto, personally, but, to the country as a whole. So thank you very much for talking to me.
All right. Thank you. No, thank you, Frank. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Okay. Yep.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you.